I look forward to inviting you to hear our speaker today, Iona Sajas-Martin. And she's going to be giving a talk on the Sustainable Development Goals. And here's a little blurb of her talk. In September 2023, the international community came together to recommit to the United Nations Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals. Despite lack of overall progress at the halfway mark, and indeed with significant setbacks in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, all countries agreed that the agenda continues to be worth pursuing. With the poly crisis in full swing, how relevant are the Sustainable Development Goals to a new generation of policymakers and voters? Is leaving no one behind attainable? Is Agenda 2030 a quaint relic of a bygone era of multilateralism or prescient blueprint to save the planet? So that's going to be our talk for today. I look forward to hearing you, and thank you guys so much for attending.
Thank you.
I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Sandra, and thanks for having me, and thank you everybody for being here on a beautiful sunny February day. My name is Iona Sajas-Martin. I'm the visiting fellow here at the Arthur Kruger College of Public Affairs. I've been teaching 2 courses this year, both of them centered on the Sustainable Development Goals. Prior to being here, normally, this is sort of who I am, and so you know who I'm talking to. I'm currently on leave from Global Affairs Canada. I have worked with that department and various iterations of it for a number of years. With 25 plus years in international affairs overall. I'm a NIPSIA grad from 1995, so it's been fun kind of coming back to campus and re-engaging with the Carleton community. I'm a writer, I'm a coach, and I'm a mom. I have 3 post-secondary kids at home, and so I think a lot about the future because of them. And I've been enjoying engaging with students like yourselves who are their peers, because I hear more from you than I do from them at home. I'm a woman, I'm white, but I have a mixed heritage. I'm a first-generation settler in Canada. I have mixed heritage from Puerto Rico and Greece, and I've spent time living in Hong Kong, which allowed me the opportunity to travel all around Asia. I recently had a conversation with my son. I've been working on international development issues for a long time. And as I mentioned, my kids are post-secondary. And I recently had a conversation with him to see what he knew about the SDGs and whether he thought that they mattered. He did know about them. And in fact, it's coming up in a lot of his studies. He's studying entrepreneurship, not global issues. And yet I was really happy to know that it was coming up in his courses. His views were as follows. Goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, and goals in general matter, but if you can't achieve them, then they don't. There's that dichotomy between nice to say words and what's actually achievable. And he thought it was really important to distinguish between time-bound commitments versus ongoing commitments. He said you need a balance between goals that are realistic and ambitious. But that ambitious is important. In his view, the net zero by 2050 goal is too little, too late. The idea of the SDGs and leaving no one behind matters because it keeps the focus on people. But we know we're not going to achieve that by 2030, but we should keep going. No poverty, which is a clear goal of the SDG framework by 2030, is just not achievable. And so we shouldn't focus on the nice words, but how to get there. And to do that, we need to be realistic, truthful, and accountable. Focus on the concrete targets beneath the goals, because they do provide a roadmap and give direction and focus. I thought, great, you've just written my presentation for me, and we're good to go. To me, it links to the broader question of why international development matters, not just in the world, but also here in Canada. This is Artie. Not sure if anybody has seen her before or knows who she is. Artie's a 4.4 million year old skeleton of a species named Ardipithecus remedis. She was found in the Afar Depression of Ethiopia, very near where the skeleton Lucy was found. Lucy was only 3.2 million years old, and so Ardi is another million years older than her. What's interesting about Ardi, and what was different about Lucy, is that Ardi climbed trees and also walked upright. In the scientific world, she's known as an inconvenient woman who did not slot easily into definitions and prevailing theory. To me, she encompasses, and I've developed a mnemonic advice around why development matters. It's about access to services. It's about rights. It's about diversity, not just of people, but of countries and of situations and of approaches. And it's about getting at the root of inequality, again, between people and between countries and between regions. Why is this important, and why is it important now? The Sustainable Development Goals were created to get at the root of poverty and inequality, and essentially to eliminate it. We'll talk a little bit later about how they were developed, but right now I want to focus on why. So it's this idea of multidimensional poverty, not just by economic rates and not just by economic rates and income, but what access do people have to food, to energy, to education for their children. It's of course about the climate crisis. Don't need to talk about that too much. February 27th, and it's going to be 13, 14 degrees today. It's about the economic impact of COVID-19. In fact, before COVID-19 hit, global poverty rates were already declining, were increasing, sorry, the gap was increasing again. And yet the economic impact of COVID-19 even further accelerated that. So poverty rates are going up, not down. And of course, a lot of conflict, migration, and global challenges in that sense. There are more than 110 conflicts currently ongoing worldwide. 45 in the Middle East and North Africa region, 35 in sub-Saharan Africa, 21 across the Asia-Pacific region, 7 in Europe, mostly around Russia and its neighbors, Ukraine being the obvious one, and 6 in Latin America. What many people don't know is that these two women were actually behind what we now know as the Sustainable Development Goals. They are Colombian, whoops, sorry, I'm hitting the wrong. One is a World Bank official from Colombia named Paula Caballero. The other is a Colombian Foreign Affairs official named Patty Londoño. Paula had experienced through her work in the World Bank a lot of engagement with developing countries and regions all around the world. And in her work following and during the Millennium Development Goals, which were agreed in 2000 to be achieved by 2015, she felt frustrated that they were conceived only by a small group of nations and people, mostly developed nations, that they didn't include much reference to the environmental considerations, and that they weren't reflective of a participatory process. And so they recommended that, and this is how the development goals were negotiated and agreed to. The goals, you've probably all seen the pretty pictures, cover 16 areas of action and include a 17th one around partnership and bringing the global community together. They're interlinked, they're integrated. It's hard to imagine one without the others. If you did an exercise to prioritize them, you'd probably have lots of converging and differing opinions. Is it more acceptable and more successful to focus on education first or health? Do you need strong institutions before you can do any of these? Do you need peace and justice to be able to understand how those institutions can deliver services so that people do have access to what they need and rights before the law? Do people need to be able to work first in order to generate enough income and stimulate the economy? Should you focus on climate action first? Because if the planet doesn't exist, then it's kind of a moot point. When these were negotiated, this was the situation 2 years before. So the negotiations process started in about 2013. This was a few things that were going on in the world at that time. In Canada, we had the Lac Mégantic disaster. In the US was the Boston Marathon bombing and the Edward Snowden leaks. Nelson Mandela died that year. There were a number of natural and not natural, man-made disasters that caused many deaths. Syria used chemical weapons on its people. The Black Lives Matter movement really took force and energy following the acquittal of George Zimmerman. In 2014, there was a shooting here on Parliament Hill. The Ebola epidemic took place in Africa. Russia annexed Crimea, setting the stage for the war today. ISIS was declared a new terror group. The US restored diplomatic relations with Cuba. There was the death of Michael Brown. And even though the phrase had been previously used in other situations, again, it really took public by great recognition. And now the phrase, "I can't breathe," is really quite common in understanding the inequality of Black people all over the world, but especially in the US. 2015, we have a Liberal government introduced in Canada. Prime Minister Trudeau started. There was the migrant crisis really hit a high in Europe. Some of you may remember the picture of Alan Kurdi washed up on the beach, which really brought to bear and focused attention in North America and Europe in a way that hadn't been before. Other situations occurred as well, and I'll leave those on the screen and you can reflect. I mention these to take us back, and it's not that long ago, but for students here, for this generation, for people like my son and my kids, this is ancient history. They were little kids at this time. This was the context within which, however, the goals were starting to be negotiated. The process that was introduced, largely inspired by the two women I mentioned earlier, was that there would be an open to all stakeholders process. It wouldn't just be cooked up by a few government officials in a UN office or European and North American capitals. The UN system brought together governments, civil society organizations, the private sector, academics, youth, rights activists. And they took stock of what had been achieved under the previous framework, the Millennium Development Goals. There was a lot of technical analysis and reliance on expertise, on subject matter experts. There were a lot of contentious topics, of course. Some of the main ones had to do with how to address issues around sexual and reproductive health and rights. What does healthcare services mean? It can sometimes be considered code for things like access to safe abortion. How do you phrase issues around peace, justice, and governance and get agreement amongst 182 nations on how to get there and what that means? Climate change was actually there were still countries and people and decision makers on the fence around what it really meant and how long it would take before it was a real crisis. There was also a lot of discussion about how to get there. What were the means of implementation? It had to be more than international assistance and official development assistance. While the recognition of a 0.7 of GDP as a measure for how much international assistance should be provided by the development community, there was also recognition that that was hard to get to, and it needed to be more than just that stream of financing. There needed to be policy coherence. In countries like Canada or the US, Europe, rich countries, to look at how do their domestic policies influence things going on internationally. There was also this need and a recognition that we needed more data. We needed evidence. We needed to be able to understand which people, where, and how to make an impact and what would grow. So this would require increasing and improving the statistical capacity, for example, in developing countries, but also partnerships to have effective transfer of technology, to have effective cooperation, to build innovative financing beyond official development assistance and engage the private sector, for example. Gradually, over the course of 2 years, 2013 and 2014, there actually emerged a lot of consensus around the goals. There were lots of discussions, 17 too many. There had been 8 MDGs, Millennium Development Goals. What was the right number? Should it be 10? Should it be 12? Should it be 5? Should it be 2? In the end, there was broad consensus on the number of goals, but also the specific targets underneath. And 169 specific targets under each goal were developed. Again, agreed to through that consensus and consultation with experts and the wider community. It's really hard to overstate how important and how unusual that was. If any of you have been to the General Assembly Hall in the United Nations, it's quite impressive. This is where the world comes to meet. And it can feel really idealistic, but it can also feel very energizing to be surrounded by people representing their countries from all over the world. To think that there was that possibility to agree on a pathway to improve lives of people and to secure the health of the planet was really exciting, at least for policy wonks like me, but also for people who were engaged in civil society, in private sector, in academia. There was this sense of being able to help change the world. Of course, there was a formal negotiations process afterwards, and that took almost a year. And there were 3 parallel processes happening at the same time. There was a negotiated process to get at financing for development. So there was an agreement called the Addis Ababa Agreement that really articulated where the money was going to come from. And again, it was going to go beyond official development assistance and get into other tracks. The SDGs were being negotiated at the same time, as was the climate change agreement, the Paris Agreement. So picture that, 3 major frameworks that are still used today were being negotiated at the same time. A few principles that came out of the SDG framework, the Agenda 2030 as it's also called, that hadn't been in the Millennium Development Goals framework beforehand were universality. This framework was going to apply to all countries, not just developing countries. That was important because, as we know, we can see it even in Ottawa. Poverty exists, hunger exists, lack of resources or lack of access to resources exists, environmental damage exists in every country in some shape or form. And so it's not enough for wealthy countries to be telling developing countries what they should do, but there was a recognition that we had to also get our own houses in order, which led to the idea of common but differentiated responsibilities. The framework isn't a treaty. It's not legally binding. It is aspirational, and it recognizes that different countries and different regions will have different priorities and needs at any given time. There is a voluntary national review process, and this is in recognition of the need to ensure some kind of accountability. It's great to have goals and targets, but how do you know you're reaching them? And who's paying attention? It is a voluntary process, but many countries have now reported, and Canada has reported twice in the last few years on our own progress domestically. Lastly, the concept of leave no one behind was a strong principle underpinning the Sustainable Development Goals. It was meant to bring and reach all people the poorest of the poor, the most marginalized, both in terms of people and countries. Leave no one behind. I was thinking again about that conversation with my son, who was saying it's important to have ambitious goals. Can you really say that we can leave no one behind by 2030? A little bit juxtaposed there. There is a recognition, probably even in 2015, that that wasn't going to be possible by 2030. And yet it's a strong foundational principle because it's a motivator. It keeps us looking forward to what is possible. The framework mostly focused on this phrase called the poorest of the poor. There was a lot of emphasis on reducing inequality between men and women. There was recognition that there are regions or types of countries like small island developing states or least developed countries that had to have a stronger focus. There was much less attention, although it's not completely absent, there was much less mention of indigenous peoples, persons with disabilities, LGBTQ communities. And so these are areas and people that the international community is trying to pay more attention to and modernize or update the approach to the Sustainable Development Goals. Why? Well, we know that 700 million people live in extreme poverty. That's just if you measure it by living on less than $2.15 US per day. Just over half of them live in sub-Saharan Africa. There are 134 million people in need of urgent humanitarian aid. There are 281 million international migrants. This was in 2021, so the number will certainly be higher by now. There are over 370 million indigenous people worldwide. 1.3 billion people, that's 16% of the global population, have a significant disability. That's more than the number of people in extreme poverty, if you look at the comparison of numbers. And there are 65 jurisdictions, countries or regions, where consensual same-sex sexual activity is criminalized. And in 12 of those, it's punishable by the death penalty. It's really hard to conceptualize numbers like that. But when you think about, it's not numbers, it's people. 700 million people, 134 million people, 281 million people, etc. That helps us keep focus on leave no one behind. These are the people that we're talking about. Where's the progress? This past September, there was a halfway meeting at the UN General Assembly to discuss how things were going. There has been some progress, not a lot, but 15% of the targets have been reached or are on track to be reached by 2030. There have been improvements in key areas, including poverty reduction. Child mortality rates have decreased, access to electricity has increased, and the battle against certain communicable diseases and tropical diseases is being shown progress. Of course, there's a lot more that needs to be done. In Canada, our government has chosen to focus on 5 specific goals while doing action on all of them, but these have been identified as priority areas. We're currently considered to be well positioned to attain the goal of reducing poverty by 50% by 2030. In education, there still are inequities in access to education, particularly by Indigenous peoples. The percentage of youth with disabilities in school has increased, so that's on the positive. The employment rate of women aged 25 to 54 was 81.4% in 2022, compared with 88% among men. So there's still some work to be done there on the gender equality side. We have increased official development assistance, although right now it's stable. It's at about 7.8 or 8 billion, but that has gone up since 2015 when it was more like 5. What needs to change, though, is about how we talk about the SDGs and how we collaborate and how we communicate about the urgency, but also about the action that can be taken. There's that whole multilateral process, there's government processes, there's working groups, there's networks, there's policy that's being done in governments, international assistance is being contributed. How can we engage the public more, though, so that it's not just the policy wonks and the government decision makers, but that it's everyday people talking about and learning about and coming up with ideas to innovate and bring action to these issues? There is a role for journalism and public affairs here to tell a story about people and what they're facing. There is a role for governments and international organizations to take into account public communications and not just use all the gobbledygook terms that we talk about, innovative financing mechanisms. Okay, what that means is how do you get private investment to contribute and create jobs? Capacity development. Well, what that means is using people's skills, making sure they have training, making sure that they have access to other resources and networks of knowledge. And there's a role for social media. Things happen so quickly. How can we look at events or circumstances and share them in a way that ties and doesn't just say, hey, this is happening, but hey, this is linked to helping us achieve no hunger. This is linked to helping us clean water. This is linked to helping us improve agriculture and all the other goals. So that's public communications. Another way that I think that we can reach more people is by promoting the use of literature, either in academia or in public policy or just in everyday life, but looking at how can we really learn about the needs and issues of people in places that we don't necessarily know something about, or in places that we do, to be able to see our own stories in other stories. And even if it's fiction, how can that help us adapt and communicate and build empathy with people that we haven't normally interacted with? A guy by the name of Mats Harlsden at Oslo has done his master's thesis on the topic of sustainable literature and fiction and the mind. And he talks about fiction being able to address the most pressing and current issues because it tells a variety of stories that mirror the problems we have today. That it's not just what it tells, but also how. Looking again, what do you see? These images were taken through by being inside a minibus on the streets of Kenya. It's a bustling market. There's lots of people. There's lots of noise. There's lots of stuff. A lot of these are clothing that were taken and bought from or just dumped by organizations and companies like Value Village or other thrift stores. If they can't sell them here in our markets, then they get dumped in a market in other countries, the Philippines, many places in Africa. On the one hand, there's a positive side to it, access to cheap clothes. But what's the flip side? The flip side is that the local fabric industry or textiles industry gets drowned out, getting that cheap Adidas shirt instead of a locally made vest or t-shirt. There is opportunity for income there. A lot of these stalls are run by women and this may be their main source of income. So that's a positive. They have the ability to generate income themselves, and they're usually investing more in their families than their partners or male counterparts are doing. And that's one of the whys of why gender equality and focusing on empowerment and access to resources for women, which gets talked about so much. That's one of the reasons why. A third way that I think is really important in terms of learning more and getting access to relevant and innovative solutions is to access research from the Global South. Up until now, so much of the policies and programs that have been developed have been based on very good and very important research done in London, in Washington, across Europe, in Canada. There's a lot of capacity that's in the Global South. Research that's local, that's connected to real people, and an understanding of what the cultural dimensions and the political dimensions are to be able to deliver it. So just 3 examples. Southern Voice is a network of think tanks from across the Global South. They have over 50 members, a lot of research. They focus on domestic solutions, but they also look at the state of the SDGs worldwide and provide an analysis of how things are going. The Partnership for Economic Policy is a think tank based in Nairobi, but again is a network of researchers from across the Global South who work specifically together with policymakers. So all of their research projects and teams include academics and experts, but also government officials working in those top areas. And so they work together to develop actionable, policy-oriented, and programmable research. Finally, the International Development Research Centre, which is a Canadian Crown corporation, but its mandate is to fund international and developing country research by people in and researchers in the developing world. And so again, and they've been doing this for over 50 years. So it's not a new concept, but right from the beginning, their mandate was to work at the local level. And so there's lots of information and analysis and tools available from local researchers. On storytelling, Essie Adujan, who's a Giller Prize winner, was the Massey lecturer last year, I believe. And she's written, the lecture series is now available as a book called Out of the Sun on Race and Storytelling. And here again, she's talking about how to bring forward the stories and the perspectives of people who often remain previously unseen. Talking about how can people speak from unequal places and have equal standing before governments, before communities. Bringing the hidden into view. So whether we're writing stories in literature, whether we're writing stories in public media, whether we're writing policy and doing research, again, that focus on people. Who are we talking about? Bringing people out of the shadows, bringing their issues out of the shadows and focusing on them will help us get at real solutions because they will be focused on real people. In my class on global literature this semester, we're reading a number of pieces, and I just want to share these with you as examples of how you can learn about global challenges and about the possibilities of the SDGs through perspectives. So there's many memoirs, and these are some of the ones that we were looking at. Short stories, especially by people, we have so much access here in Canada to writers who've come from the diaspora, either themselves as immigrants or come from immigrant communities. Even fiction and novels. These are all just some that have very concrete relation to the SDGs. Ducks, the first one on the top left, is about a woman from Newfoundland who goes to work in the oil sands in Alberta, experiences a lot of sexual and gender-based violence, but she went because of the economic opportunities, because the community she came from in Newfoundland was poor, and there weren't opportunities for her there. Homegoing by Yagyasi is about two sisters during the time when the slave trade began. One sister stays in Africa. The other sister is shipped to North America, and it follows their lives across generations and across time. Isabel Allende's Island Beneath the Sea is about Haiti and the struggles there, both from a gender and political dimensions. I won't go through all of them, but just to say you can look at these and many, many others, and it allows you again to build empathy, connect with people and communities. I'd like to share just and give the last word to some of my students from whom I've been learning a lot this year. Why do the SDGs matter? Do they? Should we continue after 2030? Some have talked about the SDGs and climate action like a puzzle. That it's all connected, the solutions, and that until you have the full picture, you're not complete and you're not there. Some people are just being really frank and saying, we have made little progress and we're not likely to achieve all the intended goals by 2030, only 7 years away. Someone else said, we must be more ambitious in our goal setting. The SDGs should be extended past the 2030 deadline. Let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater. Let's keep going, but make them relevant to current issues and people. There is a need for recognition that we need the ambition to make change, but sometimes I think people of this generation feel they have nowhere to channel it. We know the problems, but okay, what can we do about it? So how can we teach about the goals and the targets and the solutions in school? How can we increase public knowledge about it so it's not just what government bureaucrats are working on? And there's encouragement to focus on tailored targets and internal reporting structures. Make progress at the national and subnational levels. Have regionally focused goals, but things and approaches that are globally coordinated. I want to take you back to Ardi and leave you with one final question. 4.4 million years from now, will somebody find us? Thank you.